moderator is Professor Robin Ward. While Robin gets organized for the panel, I'd be grateful if you would allow me to roll the credits a little bit. First of all, I want to thank these amazing speakers who all brought their A game today to talk about the post-industrial city. I'm sure that you will agree with me that today has been an absolutely rich experience from a variety of standpoints in the humanities and social sciences. So could you join me in giving them a collective hand? Next, I want to thank my amazing staff for helping me to run this conference. First, there is my administrative assistant, Jennifer Leonard, who's very shy. I cannot run this center without her assistance. And she is complemented by an amazing group of student assistants. Some of them are here. Take a bow. Some are outside. But I cannot run the center without their assistant. This is Alexandria and Meta Jab, who is our web mistress, is outside, and Emily is not here today. So I must thank you all for Then I want to thank this audience. Now, it's difficult to run a conference like this. It's not like you have a conference and people are invited from all over the country and you have a captive audience. This kind of conference, to get an audience, people have to find time between their classes, and if they don't normally come down to campus on a Friday, they'll have to make that specific effort. But yet, so to have an audience of this size at the end of the day indicates your dedication to scholarship and your support for the Humanities Center. So I don't know if you can give yourself a clap. Now, for our final session, which would be moderated by Robin.
Also, Walter, could we say thank you to you for doing this whole thing, putting it together, making this happen.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a few people who have invited to come along, and they know who they are, so please come up and sit down. We'll move all the technology away because that gets in the way. And even the table will move out of the way. Unfortunately, it would be good if we could be even clearer beside you, but we can't. So, come and join us.
Also, at the end of this panel, we have a reception right across the hall, and there you get a chance to talk to the speakers and interact in an informal fashion. It's an important moment in the conference, so please stay for that also.
Okay. If I could ask my colleagues to join me here. I don't think we even need we don't really need the microphone, I don't think.
Probably there's an option.
Okay, we'll have it. Okay, we'll have it. Well, thank you for staying. I want to repeat what Walter has said. It is remarkable, if I can say that, for a Friday, because as we know in the university world, Fridays don't actually exist. So the fact that you're here is excellent, and I think it also shows the interest there is in this topic, where there's so many different disciplines, from the fine arts all the way through to literature, to the sciences, and in the more normal area of discussion from the social sciences. We have a fine group of people here. I've seen one of them. I don't know where George has gone, but I think he's probably going to walk through the door in a couple of minutes. I sincerely hope so. You know who they are, but I'm just going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves after I've said a few words. And I want to be quite provocative, because I was provoked, and I'll tell you why we were provoked in our business. Because about 2 months ago, many of us received an announcement from our sister university in Ann Arbor. And this particular announcement raised a visceral response from many people here at Wayne State who are interested in this world. Because the University of Michigan announced that they were considering the recognition of a, quote, Detroit School of Urban Studies. A Detroit School of Urban Studies. Now my reaction was complex and mixed, and here's another of our panel who's walked through the door. Now she knows this campus better than most, so her timing is immaculate. Heather, come and join us. My reaction to this announcement was conflicted. On the one hand, it was quite negative. On the one hand, I said, my God, hubris knows no bounds. That they can suddenly announce in a bit of paper that we have a Detroit School of Urban Studies. Big Ten arrogance, with respect to our colleagues from other parts of the, like, ever-expanding Big Ten. And also, it was from highly selective voices. I mean, who is to select? Who is to say? Who is to write this down? So my reaction was negative. On the other hand, it was also very positive, because I've been playing around with this topic all my life, and here was an exciting concept that would engage our professional world. We're not a discipline, we know that. We're not a discipline, we're a collection of interests. Some professional, some academic, some scholarly, some public, and this was therefore quite exciting. And this could be, secondly, an amazing opportunity to see interconnected research and instruction and engagement that would engage us all. And also, thirdly, this announcement might be potentially very powerful, because here could be research base, a strong research base that would inform policy analysis, and also, believe it or not, because of where I come from and Heather comes from, prescription, because that is our business. Our business is not stopping at saying what's right or wrong, but saying how we might inform others to make positive, we hope, positive change. So my reaction to the Detroit School was one of confliction. So I've left with 3 questions, which are why I put this group of people together. I thought, well, let's see what other voices there are. I don't want them just coming out of the diag in Ann Arbor. I'd like to hear them from other places. So I've drawn together a group of very cross-disciplinary scholars and writers and thinkers who have come into and are part of this urban world. And you've got their names in front of you. I don't even tell you where they're from, but you can see that they're diverse in discipline, in thinking, in approach, and they also have different names. So they should be heard, which is what you're going to hear, I hope. Now, my second question to them, of course, is there a body of scholarship that is emerging here out of places that are going through this wrenching structural change, which is not, as they stated in their report, based upon the historical migration-led, economic development-based Chicago school coming out of the 1920s, nor the globalization transformation of the place that came out of the Los Angeles school, the 2 schools referred to in this paper. What is there in your work, what is there in your reading, what is there in your thinking that makes this place distinctive, and does it add up to more than just a set of individual stories? Because you've all got good stories. And if that is the case, thirdly actually, how do we strengthen that? How do we make that important? How do we bring that discussion to bear and contribute to something that may indeed be a school of thought around a new place, a new city that is quite different than Chicago of the 1920s or Los Angeles of 1980. So that's my challenge at 4 o'clock. If they don't speak, we can actually go to the bar right now. Which is a thought, I have to say, on Friday afternoon.
So tempting.
Who should we go to? I'm going to go to my very good friend, Michigan State University. I've already slammed the Big Ten, so there you go.
It's fine, because we're feeling a little hurt ourselves. I'm just going to stand up because I don't think people really can hear me back there. So I'll just give a little background. I've been at Michigan State since 1997. That's about 14 years. But I've been an academic longer than that. I actually decided to study declining cities when I was in high school. Because I grew up outside of Cleveland. I wanted to understand why Cleveland was declining. And so I went to Boston University on a scholarship and studied sociology and geography. So I actually approached this question about cities from an interdisciplinary point of view from a pretty young age. And BU actually had a pretty good urban studies program, very interdisciplinary too, history and English, and a really great geography department, which I loved. And then I went to graduate school where I decided, yeah, sociology is really the best place to study this. But I also took a lot of classes in urban planning, because my chair happened to be in urban planning at that time too. And then my first job was part sociology, part urban studies. And now I have the most fantastic job ever. I actually teach at James Madison College, which is an interdisciplinary public affairs college at MSU. As a sociologist, but I do everything, and all my colleagues do everything. So we have a small liberal arts program in the middle of Big U. I have amazing colleagues across this campus that are doing urban like crazy, in part because we used to have a College of Urban Affairs that got disbanded. I have a great colleague, Laura Reese, who was hoping to be here too, but couldn't, who's the director of the new Global Urban Studies program, which for me is paradoxical because we are the quintessential land-grant College of Michigan. We have had rural extension program since its founding, and we had a really fantastic urban extension program since the 60s, and now all of that's gone. We don't do Detroit, even though it's in our backyard. We don't even do other cities in Michigan much, because we've got this global urban studies direction. So to think about a Detroit school coming out of Michigan, yikes. So that has visceral components for me too. But I've been teaching Detroit for a really long time. I've been teaching Detroit for about 25 years, in part because it's the quintessential story of decline for some, not for me. I'm a huge fan of Detroit. I bring my students here every year for, and my colleagues and other students too, for tours of Detroit. It's not so easy actually for people from Michigan to get to Detroit in a day. It seems like a long drive to that to us. You do start early in the morning, we stay till late at night. So I was actually teaching Detroit when I lived in LA and when I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and so Detroit is something I've been teaching for a really long time. So how do you teach Detroit? Is there a Detroit school? And because the story of deindustrialization, post-industrialism, and whatever comes next, because we don't really have a good name for what's next. We only know what we're not. We're postmodern, we're post-industrial, we're deindustrialized. So what are we now going towards? I mean, that's a huge interdisciplinary question. And we can talk about flexible accumulation. Postmodern doesn't tell you what, it's a fragmented narrative. I incorporate a lot of film, I incorporate a lot of poetry in my classes, as well as geography and sociology. So I just think anyone does urban has to do all of these things anymore. You know, from sociology's point of view, there's postmodernism, which we haven't embraced very well because we're social scientists. There's also some who refer to it as hypermodernism, and Giddens refers to this as hypermodernism. So I don't think there's new tools, except that we all have to embrace a lot of different ones. And I don't know if it feels like this to you all, but it feels like this to me, and this is why this whole day was so stimulating. Is because we really get to leave behind all the disciplinary stuff we used to do all our work with and get to explore all kinds of new things. So there's work to be done, but it's really exciting. It's discovery every day, and that's in some ways I'm at the university anyway. But what does it mean to discover a new poem or a new video, like we were introduced to today, to look at this world of Detroit in a whole different kind of way? It's interesting because I'm actually teaching a course right now in a new major that we have called Comparative Cultures and Politics. And I'm teaching a course on global cities and urbanism, but the culture of cities in different kinds of places. And I just finished teaching this week John Friedman's book on China's system of cities, so I was reading a whole bunch of stuff on Shanghai. And so there's this really great article that just came out in 2011 on Shanghai. And the person who wrote this article asks, does the LA school explain Shanghai? And you know, it's a good question because we think we're done with the Chicago school because that was really about the industrial city. And LA is a quintessential postmodern city, so maybe that we need to think about the LA school being the new hangar that we rely on. But this author sort of introduces Michael Deere and moves on very quickly and says, well, there's a whole backpack full of concepts that are useful to us, including the dual city, find my long list. It's Kathy Young Liu who wrote this article. There's is Shanghai a world city? Well, maybe it's not a world city according to Saskia Sassoon's definition, but it certainly is a mega city. Is it a cyber city? Well, it's moving that way. It certainly is a dual city. It is a hybrid city, and by hybrid she's referring to those who are foreign-born, those who are indigenous to the city and versus outsiders. Thinking about race. Is it a sustainable city? And so she's got like this shopping list of concepts you have to go through. And I think if we're not at some place, theoretically one place, a Detroit school, we do have really useful concepts that we have to study any place through all of these different concepts. I think that's the best I can do from my own research and from my own students and thinking about places. We're using all of these different kinds of things. Like, you have this rubric of advanced capitalism, or what does that mean? Or globalization, what does that mean? And all of these cities are situated in these advanced capitalisms or, global processes. And I hate to use globalization because it's so cute, but it truly, I think, has some utility. So when I think about Detroit, what I teach, is teach political economy. You have to teach political economy. You have to teach the role of the spectacle city. Peter Eisinger did a great piece on the spectacle city and how that doesn't deliver what Detroit really needs recently. You have to use the humanities. You have to look at the new immigrants that are moving here. My students doing this one project that I have on this class in Detroit. It's like 7 different chapters that take 7 different kinds of how to know Detroit. It's a fragmented enterprise, that's all I can say.
Good. Well, I'm going to jump and take the prerogative as the moderator and jump to my colleague beside me, because for those of you who don't know George Galster, he's an urban economist. He's a very different urban economist. And I'm actually going to give him a plug, because he's going to do a product, which I think develops the theme that Ruby has just given us because of its attempt to layer different views of this place through this work. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, thank you, Rob. The product that Robin is alluding to is a forthcoming book called Driving Detroit, The Quest for Respect in Motown. And this is an attempt to, I think for the first time, comprehensively explain why Detroit is the way it is. not to do voyeuristic journalism, not to go, oh, isn't that terrible, but to try to understand the why. And as you were suggesting, Louise, to understand the why takes lots of different spectacles, and I'm going to use a pun on your term, spectacle. You have to have a lot of different lenses through which to see the city to understand the why of someplace as complicated as Detroit. And so, if you're interested in this product that Robin is alluding to, there's a little green flyer that's outside on the table if you haven't snagged one already. Thank you, that's what it looks like. It's coming out from the University of Pennsylvania Press next summer. And the basic notion of the book is a notion that I hope is applicable to a variety of cities, but it's going to be applied first as a prototype to the Detroit case. And it starts from, of all things, not an urban economics perspective, but a psychological perspective. It starts by saying, what is it that citizens of any metropolitan area search for? What do they really quest? And if you go to psychology, my reading suggests that they quest three basic kinds of resources. They quest physical resources, food, clothing, shelter. They quest sociological resources, friendship, community, and they quest certain psychological resources, self-esteem, efficacy, purpose. Fine. Then you could ask the question, does your metropolitan area help you and give you opportunities to succeed in your request to gain all these resources, or does it constantly frustrate you? And I argue in this book that Detroit's economic base and its housing market systematically frustrate citizens of this metropolitan area's attempts to gain these modicum of resources, what I call respect, in a summary term. And I don't have time here this afternoon to talk about all the ways in which the economic base and the housing market frustrate Detroiters' attempts to obtain respect. But I argue that, like all humans with agency, if you systematically and perpetually frustrate your attempts to get these basic resources, you will adapt to this frustrating environment. And how Detroiters have adapted, when I say Detroiters, I mean Metro Detroiters now. How Detroiters have adapted is by trying to find other mechanisms to get respect, to get these resources. So they unionize like crazy as an attempt to get over the frustrations of having big corporations imposing their will upon the workforce. They try to gain respect by segregating themselves by race and class. Because after all, how can you have respect for yourself if you live with someone who's a social inferior that you've defined as a social inferior? They try to gain respect and resources by fragmenting into tiny little political jurisdictions, where you can at least control this local politician if you can't control the bigger world. And you try to gain respect by engaging in identity politics like crazy. I am defined by arbitrary social constructions like race and class. He is our politician because he is somehow like us. He may be stupid, he may be corrupt, but it's okay, he's like us. All of this is our attempt to gain some senses of these various kinds of resources, I argue in the book. Now the problem, unfortunately, is that when all of us, as individual Metro Detroiters, try to gain personal resources through these actions, either individually or collectively, we collectively create an irrational metropolitan area. Because if everybody tries to gain respect by segregating themselves and fighting for each other over the political spoils, we're going to frustrate everyone's attempts collectively. So we create what I call a collectively irrational metropolitan area. That is to say, individuals undertaking actions are rational if it's the only individual doing it is yourself. But when everybody copies that model, it becomes collectively irrational that we all do this. And so we've created essentially a self-defeating metropolitan area that frustrates systematically our attempts to gain respect. Our basic underlying economy and housing market frustrate our attempts, and then our adaptations to that, ironically, have further frustrated our attempts to gain respect. I argue in the book that we've created this self-defeating, suicidal metropolis, or as I call it, a mortropolis. Yes. And that's what I hope could be the core of a Detroit school because it's a multidisciplinary notion of trying to align basic human needs with what happens in that metropolitan sphere, and how those two interact, and how humans, if they're either satisfied or dissatisfied with how their economic and housing market and other systems are operating, do adaptations. And they adapt in ways that, of course, feed back and change what that metropolitan area looks like. And that's the bind that we're in right now. So I hope that has some traction in other metropolitan areas as well, but that would be my proposal for the nub of a Detroit school.
Wonderful. Wonderful. See what I mean of these great ideas that come in? So I'm now going to jump to another person, another colleague, who is outside of, to some extent, outside of the social science realm. Constance works at LTU, Lawrence Tech University, in urban design. And the challenge, I think, that I put to her is how do we develop cogent ideas in a place where place has gone? The Chicago school evolved from a place that was just like a beehive. I mean, it was throbbing with activity and people coming and going and arriving and changing and speaking different languages and integrating and creating this great city, this wonderful city on the lake. The LA school is similarly full of activity. In this case, it's electronic, it's financial, it's movement. How do you start to build a thought process, an intellectual discourse around places that are empty, that don't have buildings, as Maine was showing us? It has lots.
So you want me to combine that answer with the introduction?
Of course. Oh,
Okay.
yeah, and more. Yeah, in 3.5 minutes.
I think my initial response to your question is that Detroit is not a place where place is gone. I tell my students that the definition of place is space imbued with meaning. So I would actually challenge the question.
Good.
So again, my name is Constance Boduro. I'm assistant professor of architecture at Lawrence Technological University. And getting back to Robin's introduction about the hubris of U of M's proposal, I just want to get in that they didn't even mention Lawrence Tech as one of the regional universities that might actually contribute a voice to the discussion. So we do have a few, very few, but mighty set of urbanists over at Lawrence that are doing some interesting work in Detroit. So, and at Lawrence Tech, I have 3 full-time jobs. The first is teaching. I do teach both architecture and urban design to architecture students and urban design students. We have an undergraduate architecture program we've just launched. We're in our 2nd year of a Master of Urban Design program. And actually one of the first, the inaugural classes here in the audience, Daniel Beard. We inherited Daniel from Robin and Wayne State. The program is...
It's okay, he's got a lullaby.
Yes, that's right. I understand that he was one of your already. Anyway,
We won't hold that against him.
very happy to have him. And we, unlike many programs of urban design in North America, we welcome students from all disciplines interested in urban design. We do not require a first degree in architecture. We find that to be, especially in the 21st century, a bit limiting. Because we accept that notion that we need all disciplines contributing to thinking about the future of the city. Teaching, I coordinate the Master of Urban Design program. That's my 2nd job. And I guess my 3rd job, probably when I'm here today, is that I created a small design lab at Lawrence called Studio CI, which originally stood for Convergence of Intensity, but now a lot of people have given it a lot more meaning. Cool Ideas was one of the recent ones that came out, but which I certainly welcome. But I'd like to, I guess, talk and answer Robert's question in the context of the work that we're doing at Studio CI. I began about 3 years ago because Charles Waldheim, do you recognize that name, the landscape urbanist? probably the father of landscape urbanism, brought one of his many studios to Detroit. As all of you know, we're very appealing to the academic and design worlds. They have a morbid fascination with us, and have for decades. I actually credit, oh my gosh, his name is, what am I, the photographer, Vergara, who started on this about 20 years ago, the documentation of our deterioration. You know, and as a designer, I guess I could give a little bit of my background. I'm a Detroiter. I was born and raised in Dearborn, but consider myself to be a Detroiter. I did my graduate work at MIT, and I was educated. I have an urban planning degree and a master's in architecture, so I believe I have a foot in both camps and practice firmly in the middle in urban design. But come from a tradition of, obviously a very rich notion of how urban design is practiced, that is beyond form only. MIT, if you're familiar with the program, has long had that tradition. So, stayed in Boston for 10 years, practiced, but I believe that Detroit has a very long tether, just like perhaps Cleveland does, or any post-industrial city, and came back about 10 years ago. First taught at University of Detroit Mercy, and then joined Lawrence Tech 4 years ago, actually. Again, my research, when I started really focusing on Detroit, Charles had asked me to participate in his studio, and again, it was from a perspective, landscape urbanists tend to look at the city as a vacuum, that the opportunity comes from this vacuous nature of the city. And I told Charles that I'd participate with him, but only if I could talk about what's still here, not what's gone. And so I started doing a lot of research and mapping around what I call value densification. So where do we have value in the community? Cultural value, human or habitation value, infrastructure value, things that we've invested in over centuries. And that sort of mapping and research and analysis led to a very clear sort of spatial and geographic pattern. And that's a bit where convergence of intensity comes in, that when you map these values or metrics, they actually array themselves spatially and geographically in the city. And I thought, well, maybe this is a way where we could start to think about the future form of the city. And so developed a digital interface, a tool to do this. And I think that my interest is primarily sustainability, but I'm also interested in the role of density and value in how you make decisions about a sustainable city. One, I don't believe that you can talk about sustainability without speaking simultaneously about the shrinking city, or we like to say the regressive city. I know people don't like the term shrinking. That's sort of a no-no these days. So I think you have to think simultaneously about regression, stasis, and explosion. Right? You can't think about Detroit without thinking about Shanghai. Largely the West is in stasis. A lot of the West is shrinking, but explosive growth in cities is not sustainable either. Shanghai is actually sinking under the weight of its built density. Has anybody heard that? It cannot continue to grow at this rate. It's unsustainable. So, I think it's very important for us to perhaps, and this may get into some of what George was saying about how respect and how we think about ourselves. I don't think we should be ashamed of our condition wholly. We should take responsibility for it. But shrinkage may be a more ethical platform from which to work toward the future in comparison to those of explosive growth. But anyway, getting back to this idea of value densification and the tool, we spent a couple of years working in Southwest Detroit, which is one of these areas where this convergence occurred, as you might guess, right? This is one area of our city where the population is growing, largely due to immigration, Hispanic, Arabic, and even Caucasian immigration. Huge investment in infrastructure, regional and international infrastructure, wonderful cultural built density, right, and vibrant commercial quarters. So there are areas of our city that have value. We think of Detroit as a place of worth. We naively thought that this digital tool that we built could help prompt a collective dialogue in our city about these values and get to a point of metrics to actually then make some decisions, collective decisions about the future form of the city. We hear a lot today, colleagues that were once associated with Wayne State, now are with D3, that talk about a data-driven solution for Detroit. I disagree with that. I think it has to be a criteria-driven solution. And again, when we start to think about criteria or values, it means we have to talk to each other, right, about what those things are. And again, George mentioned about the challenges there. More recently, we've been funded by a Ford Motor Company, coincidentally, through the Ford Community College Challenge, and they've given us money to, because we modestly claimed we could design a net zero energy community in Detroit. And they got their attention. We then found out we could actually do it. It's possible. So again, working in Southwest, and we continue that work. So we've added to this interest about density broadly defined and convergence. We're looking at net zero energy and other sustainable approaches. And lastly, and I'll end, I know we have two more colleagues to introduce. Where we are now with it, and I mean, there are just many wonderful trajectories that this research is taking, is that we've decided that vacancy is the next generative infrastructure for Detroit. That, again, we need to think about it perhaps in a way that we haven't. And I am a proponent of urban agriculture, but I do think that we need to think about other generative uses for our vacant land. So we're looking at what we call energy farms. There's a lot of potential for that. We're looking at sort of targeted density, again, at these convergence moments. And then we're looking at other opportunities for reforestation, water cycle management. So I think we'd like to maybe turn this notion of vacancy on its head and say that really every acre of the city can have a purpose. It may not be repopulated the way it once was, but it could be generative.
Thank you. Well, Lara, I'm trying to find the link, but I think the link is all around us. To the political scientist, this has got to be the finest city for case study that you can imagine over the past few years. So, give us a perspective from the world of political science, which we haven't yet touched.
Okay, I'll do my
Am I
best.
being unfair?
No, not at all. That is fair. My name is Laura LaRouche. I'm an assistant professor of political science at UFM Dearborn. We have another Dearborn. So unless you see how this called their house here. But my training was in Ann Arbor, so I guess my lines should be divided, but they're not really. That's a Dearborn now, and the issue of a Detroit school was, it raises a number of different questions for me. One, I would think for scholars, which cities count as post-industrial would be a question in terms of who to include in such research. Which I don't know, maybe people think that's obvious, but since the recession, since the increase in foreclosures, I think a lot of cities are struggling with common issues of abandonment and losing industry. If they don't look like Detroit in terms of one single industry, maybe they've lost several. So what would we include? Maybe the Detroit school could be bigger than we first imagine. Let's see. I try to remind my students, don't forget Las Vegas is ahead of us now in terms of foreclosure. So it's, I don't know how the rest of you felt in 2008 with, when our companies were really declining and the future seemed especially uncertain. I don't know, my students seem pretty depressed. A lot of them come from auto worker families, and it gave me a new perspective on the region and the community. And I think that there's, even though the job market isn't so great, I see a lot of interest in what's happening in Detroit, and a lot of desire to be a part of a more sustainable renewal. So I take some comfort in that. I think, and the innovation that you're talking about, well, I definitely want to share with my students. And I just wonder if our political leaders are have caught up to those new energies yet. still waiting for some of that. Another thing about the Detroit school is, well, I would hope that, I would want, okay, so my background is really in studying community organizing, and so I feel fortunate to hang out with urbanists in political science, because people who study organizing and social movements and things like that, democratic practice in grassroots action, that's sort of its own little subfield. We got in the back door with the urban scholars, because those were the same people who were studying the neighborhoods in the backyards of Chicago or wherever else. So my questions in general, in terms of innovation or in terms of politics or a new urban agenda, is who's going to be brought along in the process, who won't be. I'd like to assume that, I would like to believe that that everyone would be included, but things often don't go that way. And so, as a political scientist, I would want to know how will multiple voices be included in a future urban agenda, and especially since the study of cities and post-industrialization, I think it's this, well, the idea that there are limitations on what cities can do isn't a new idea for political science and for urbanists. We've known that for a while, based on the relationship to the state, to the national government, to the way global economies work. Cities are limited in what they can do, and those of us who are invested in grassroots activism and the benefit of that wonder, well, what can local people do? What can community members do? I think that question is always there for me. So for a Detroit school, I think it would be really cool if a Detroit school put that in front, because Detroit does the other side of the coin to having, the negative image and bailouts and a post-industrial economy is this kind of edgy, cool, let's do the grassroots populist thing, right? So I think there's maybe that's not such a cool, clear explanation, but I think that young people were inspired by being involved in Detroit, partly because it has an underdog in it, and I would want a Detroit school not to be entirely led by what academe in the region who thought that this is a nice branding to put on a new proposal should be, but what are community people doing and what can we learn from them? So that would be my preference for the Detroit school.
Fantastic. Absolutely wonderful to connect to the community as well. So I've left the best for last, because we wanted to highlight one of our own students who's come from Wayne and gone to Florida and then came back, spent some time with Laura at Michigan State, and has now found her way to Ypsilanti.
Yes.
And I've also left her last because she's a planner. So the question really is also, it's all very well to have this intellectual firepower that is drawn from an analytical perspective, but how do we also shape a prescriptive perspective, which is one that takes what we have and tries to recommend, suggest, move solutions or change, which is something that we need to address. So Laura, I've left it to you, I'm sorry. Laura,
well, first, I'd just like to say it's a real treat for me to be here today as an alumni of the program, and being able to sit here with Robin Boyle and George Galster. And then after I finished my grad work, I ended up at Michigan State working with Louise in the Global Urban Studies program. So I know a lot of people up here, and just based on what Constance and Laura have said, there are many points I agree with that I will go into further. And I'm also a political scientist, so a lot of what you're saying really resonates with me. But I'm originally from this area. I'm originally from Detroit. And growing up, I heard these fantastic stories from my parents and my grandparents and family members about how, you know, when they were young, they would go downtown and they would do all their shopping at Eastern Market, and they would go to Hudson's, and, you know, the Christmas displays stretched 12 floors, and just these, you know, really beautiful stories. And I was trying to reconcile those images with the images that I saw growing up. And I think that's ultimately what drove me to go into urban planning, and what better place I thought than to come to Detroit. And so that is my road here. What I'd like to say, something that really struck me that I didn't plan on even discussing today, but as I was driving here from Ypsilanti, as soon as you cross into the city limits of Detroit, I was driving, it was 94. And as soon as you know, they have the green city limit sign, welcome to Detroit, and underneath it, it said, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm not a huge football fan, but the year we hosted the Super Bowl, I know it was 2006. So, but it said, welcome to the city of Detroit, city limits, home of Super Bowl, and whatever it was, 36. And I found that so interesting. Coming from a planning perspective, so often the things that gain the most attention, certainly in the media and by scholars, are those big mega projects, the building of Comerica Park and hosting the Super Bowl, and all of these things. And those are wonderful things, and they're critical, and I come from an economic development perspective as well. But I think, you know, when we sit down to truly craft plans, something that really can be documented over the last several decades in Detroit is you have people coming in from the outside that might have really great ideas about Detroit and what to do with Detroit, and you know, innovative things. But when those ideas are not coming from, and that's not saying you can't integrate them, but much as Laura was saying, I'm very much in favor of a bottom-up approach and a community approach, because we create these tourist bubbles, so to speak. We've got Ford Field and Comerica Park, and very possible that we're going to be, you know, moving the hockey arena. And so we create these bubbles that serve people that don't live in the city. And what about the many people that are left there? And so when Robin posed the question, you know, is there a body of scholarship to support a Detroit school? My first reaction, and it may sound a bit Pollyanna and naive as I'm at the beginning of my career, but I thought, well, why not? Certainly, there's much to be said. Somebody mentioned about, you know, going through my notes here, how do you gain respect? Well, you gain respect by leading. And sometimes to negate decades worth of negative images, it's going to take decades to rebuild that image. But what I think really needs to be focused on more are the resources that we do have. And as Constance said, space is, or place is space imbued with meaning. And there's so much of it here. And again, this is my first semester teaching at EMU, and I'm so wonderfully surprised by the positivity and the excitement that my students have for the future of Detroit. And as a planner, we are so much about the future. And so, you know, I think when it comes to a Detroit school, I think why not? However, I do think that our problems weren't created unilaterally, and we shouldn't expect unilateral solutions. And I think that's really critical when we start integrating all of these various parts. We can't talk about the issue of the state of the Detroit public school system without talking about issues of infrastructure and crime and safety. And these are multidimensional and interconnected issues, and we need to address them as such. And I think even with the, and I'll wrap this up quickly because I know it's been a long day for all of you, but even with the urban farming, urban gardening phenomenon that's happening now in Detroit, and this idea of truly integrating sustainability. Sustainability has been a word that's been thrown around for the last 2 decades, since the very early 90s. And I think everybody has a different definition. And now it's a buzzword. And I hate to say that because of that it's lost its meaning. I don't think that it has, but I think we need to be more specific. But in terms of, I wrap up by saying I think Detroit is huge. We can talk about Cleveland, but Detroit is 140 square miles. We are almost twice the size of Cleveland. So, just in terms of sheer size, we do have broken, buildings that are falling apart, homes that are falling apart, infrastructure that's falling apart, but we also have a lot of resources. And so I think in connection to the creation of a Detroit school, we really have the resources if we utilize them in the right way to really, again, gain respect by showing that model of what true sustainability, a sustainable city could look like. So.
Give a round of applause for that. It was wonderful. Okay, you're here. It is 5:25. We have got about half an hour before I think we lose you all. This is your time to either ask questions of these range of different individuals with different perspectives, or share your own thoughts as to the nature of what the contemporary city that we're living in here today can add to our general thinking about place and community. Is there any life left in our community? Frank.
You forgot to include the perspective of a historian in this thing, and I've insulted her. Just so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a historian. I would suggest that maybe we need to look a little longer term in the history of Detroit when we're sort of revising this whole thing and look at where Detroit came from, how it developed, and then how it rose, how it declined. But think of it as a cycle or a circle or a spiral. In other words, what we want to do with this Detroit school is create a kind of a quick, easy, instant social science solution. It's not going to happen. But if you think of the Detroit that was in the 18th century as a wilderness on the water, and in certain ways Detroit is returning to be a wilderness on the water. And to think about why did Detroit become, first of all, the industrial powerhouse that it was, but we were also, once upon a time, the pharmaceutical capital of the world. We were once the stove capital of the world. We were once the automobile capital of the world. And it seems to me that we're gonna go full circle. That we're gonna return to the beginning in some ways, especially in a place where you have the infrastructure for how many people? 2 million. And yet the population of how much? 750,000, right? So ultimately, I think we're gonna go back to the beginning. That's the whole thing with Detroit. And Detroit rose and grew and developed and ended organically. Well, we're not done yet, but you catch my drift.
Well, who's going to respond to this?
Frank, I totally reject your cyclical view of history of Detroit. I think history is important, but I view Detroit's history as a series of fortunate accidents that will never be repeated. Here's what I mean. First of all, it was a fortunate accident that the French and the Brits were fighting over this territory in the 1700s, and they happened to find the Straits d'Etoile a good strategic point to start a fort. And then when the beaver pelts ran out in 1840, we were damn lucky that the Erie Canal had opened up to give a market for our wood. Then the Civil War happened just at the time we were lucky enough to start our industrialization. And then we were lucky enough in the first decade of the 20th century to have, among the 80 firms trying to produce automobiles all across the United States, we had some really lucky entrepreneurial geniuses like Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers that eventually ended up to huge concentrate the industry here. We are a series of fortunate historical accidents. We have no business being a city here unless lightning again strikes this place. And I don't know why it's going to strike this place again. I think we were lucky over our 300 years of centuries, and I don't see any reason of why anything in our history predicts why we're going to be lucky again.
So you're saying forget the Detroit school, just pray?
One more response and then we'll go to the back.
Well, no, I wanted to respond because I think obviously his book is trying to get at the essential nature of Detroit or Detroiters, and what I do think looking at history is important. The city is a continuum, right? But the common theme, I think, in what you're describing is that Detroit is about making. We've always been makers. And I think we'll continue to be. We're just not going to continue to make the same things. But I also think that and Calvin Trillin had a great essay about you can't change the essential nature of a place, right? If you're founded by the Puritans, you're going to be puritanical. I think, and Robin began his whole talk with this, I wonder if you talk about this in your book. I think essential to Detroit is this idea of conflict. You brought it up with, it was the First Nations against the French against the British against the Americans, management versus unions, black versus white, this, right? It's a theme, and I think we've got to own that, obviously, in some way, and make it work.
Question at the back, comment at the back.
Yeah, first of all, I hate Henry Ford because he's a fucking Nazi. Okay, he hated black folks, Paul Robeson, and some of the other socialists and communists, both white and black, had organized a campaign just to get my people equal wages, to get on the line also with skilled trade. Okay, and the Puritans are nothing but slave drivers, racist bastards. Okay, they took this land away from the native, and I think these corporations need to be nationalized. No more outsourcing, moratorium on foreclosure. I'm with the Detroit People's Task Force. I'm the executive director. My name is Kevin Terry. I'm Nazi. Okay. We've been fighting Kim Worthy, which is a Oreo prosecutor that's been framing black people with tainted evidence. Okay. Mishandled forensic evidence. We've been dealing with that issue. Okay. You got schools closing. You got this emergency manager crap. We need to be abolished in Detroit and around the state. Okay, so let's get busy, and like I said, we got our work cut out for us, and we all should migrate together and fight against this fascist system.
All right, thank you. Yes, young man.
One thing that she said that Detroit has always been about makers. I just want to know, since it's moving from like the industrial system to more informational, would that like play do you think that plays a very big part in like Detroit's progressive behavior so far? Since it's like auto capital or whatever, and now everything, the makers are moving overseas and everything, so now it's basically just informational online, and basically a lot of people in Detroit have skills that are obsolete now, so.
Yeah, I think it's, as Heather was saying, I think it's systemic, right? I mean, we haven't done well with the transition. It's not news to anyone here. It seems to me that we haven't really provided the educational training resources for that transition. But I don't wholly agree that it's going to be all information. You know, I think there's still tangible things that can be produced in this community and are being produced, right? I mean, art was talked about all day. I apologize I didn't get to hear about everything, but I think we're still about making art in this community, aren't we?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's one thing.
You said you wanted to create a net zero community.
We
I know there's research on E. coli turning sugar into diesel for use in cars. Would Detroit respond to that if it was able to be mass produced?
You might be able. You should probably ask. You should ask Ford and Smart. We're looking a bit at urban mobility in our work, but we're looking more at renewables like solar, hydrocurrent. You know, what can we do in terms of renewables to actually generate energy to power land uses? Certainly, we're looking at alternative energy for transportation as well. But I don't know if anyone else wants to respond to that. But
Susan did.
yeah, Susan.
I've never heard of that. I think it sounds really interesting. I mean, and SMART doesn't even spend a lot of time on fuels and energy as much as the system stuff.
More the systems, right?
That's why, I mean, I'm sure somebody.
They've been able to get a few drops of diesel out of it, but it's never been able. They're trying to mass produce it.
And what's the source for the?
E. coli, they're changing its DNA to turn sugar into diesel.
I said send it to Dow.
Exactly.
To have a term for E. coli.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I have a couple of points here made, and then Tracy.
Okay, George, I just want to pick up on what you were saying about the history of Detroit being a series of kind of happy accidents. And yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, that was kind of an interesting way to position things. But you know, the circumstances happen, and people respond or they don't respond. You know, the Civil War happened. You know, these various things along the way happened, and somebody responded with inventiveness. The auto industry was. There were, as you were pointing out, you know, lots of plants around the country, lots of places where this was being explored, and you know, so this is a city that emerged. It emerged partly out of the idea of the assembly line and the breaking pieces down, and I mean that was the sort of genius that came into what was happening every place. And I mean, you can look at other examples too. You know, why was Apple such a success? Well, there were certain things that applied every place. A lot of people working on design or not working on design issues, and all of a sudden Steve Jobs notices how people interact with things and what makes things attractive. And you know, I think that along with this kind of history of happy, I don't know if I want to call them accidents, coincidences. I don't know if there really are such things as coincidences, but there have been inventive responses at moments where there have been opportunities for change. And I was kind of wondering if maybe there isn't something, maybe that's something inbred in a Detroit character, that there have been these huge moments of influence and affluence and huge valleys, and they come over and over and over again. But there's always been a kind of resilience, and the resilience has always come out of invention. It's been out of seeing in the troubled circumstance a possibility out, you know, a kind of a way out, and that gives me a little hope that. Yeah, we're again in a situation where we really don't know what we're doing, and we might just find a solution. You know, and maybe it's looking, and I think it's looking at the resources that are in our hands, and the most important resources are the people who are here, and the variety of perspectives that are here. I think one of the things we do wrong often, I mean, everybody does wrong. I'm not taking this on ourselves, but we often are so caught in our last success that we try to rebuild that one. That's what we knew was successful. And in a way, we have a huge burden in Detroit because we've been very successful. And we have a bigger burden than places that have been less successful because we have models that we think work. And I think the biggest challenge is letting go of those models and looking what the resources are that we have in our hands. And we might just find some, I don't think it's going to be one solution. I think it's going to be some solutions, but you know, I'm not so sure they're not here. I mean, I think maybe that, the resilience and the ability to let go of success, I mean, that's a huge thing to do, to let go of success. But if we can let go of success and look what we have in our hands, I don't know, I do have a lot of hope for this city.
Because Frank chided us, I'm going to turn to the story.
Yes, I'd be happy to ask some sort of a question. I guess as a historian, one of my questions is how useful, you sort of started off with what might a Detroit school look like, and my question is what's necessarily the value in having a Detroit school? The LA school, I think, is not even universally accepted as a school, right? That's very much challenged. Historians have tried to dismantle the idea that the Chicago school was a real thing, or a real model that existed outside of Chicago. So, I mean, I see the value in having a community of scholars like this one and having this kind of engagement. But you know, you said, Laura, you made a comment about it being through a branding effort by U of M, and that's very much what it feels like, right? Detroit's having this moment, this popular moment, not just in the US, but sort of internationally. And when this is my first semester, I was just hired as the new urban historian, and I took it personally when my alma mater decided to establish upon my arrival a rival school. But you know, I mean, it did seem a little bit galling, as though they're trying to capitalize on this moment. And you know, I sort of thought perhaps that was just a good way to get new hires out of the state. You know what I mean? But I mean, this is the sort of thing you do to get money in this kind of time. So my question really is, if you know these schools are seen as sort of prescriptive or theoretical models, what necessarily is the value in establishing that? And a related comment would be that it's very interesting sitting here listening to people talking about Detroit. I'm not from Detroit, I'm from Michigan originally, but I didn't, you know, this is the first time I've lived in Detroit, or near Detroit. Actually, I feel like I need to fess that up at all times, but I do not live in the city. It's, you know, Detroit has only recently become exceptional. You know, if Detroit had sort of collapsed, if the auto industry had collapsed in the 80s the way the steel industry did, it would have just been another Cleveland, Youngstown, you know, Pittsburgh along that model. So just, I think by virtue of having that kind of collapse come 20 years later, it looks like maybe it's different. But I think that I want to warn against, from a historical perspective, of looking at Detroit as too exceptional and is sort of not related to these other waves of decline that have been other places.
If I could follow up with that, I think that's a great point. And for me, what's exceptional about Detroit isn't its economic collapse, but how long the collapse has been coming.
Yeah,
and it's more that everyone realized in 2008 when all of a sudden we get the three at once, and because Detroit is so interchangeable with these three companies, whereas for people, I don't know, when I was interviewing organizers in the city reflecting on, you know, the late 80s and why they began organizing in the mid to late 80s, and because they felt it was a low point, and then they said, but it's gotten worse. And this was interviews in 2003. So for me, it's very interesting to see all of a sudden the nation is aware of some, not to be a downer, but it frustrates me to see that it's not like, you know, the statistics on population movements from SEMCOG or from you know, any data source, they've been pretty consistent. It's not like it's been a surprise to everyone. So for me, is what, you know, how have we been unable to respond? And I think part of it is another thing that Detroit is known for standing out for in scholarly literature. I don't know if it's actually that unique in this, but it's a negative epitome of the extent of segregation, the extent of racial and economic segregation, the extent of division that makes it difficult for there to be a strong regime, for there to be a strong movement for shared public vision. And that's something I think Detroit could work on, a school or a community of scholars or whoever.
But Newark and Camden could be part of that school too, right?
Yes.
I would like to disagree. I think it is exceptional, because I think, to pick up your phrase, this is the first time a brand is dissipating. It's different than Pittsburgh or Youngstown. I mean, the scale's important, no denying it. But Detroit, if you ask people what is Detroit? Detroit is many things. It's an industry. It's almost a way of life. It's also a great big city. Now, suddenly the world, and I mean the world, is challenged because this brand is suddenly means dereliction, incredible levels of poverty, falling income levels, lack of investment, the pathology of place. And it's very hard in this period of time to realize that the 20th century model, and this is a quintessential city of the 20th century, is suddenly the brand has lost its, not just its luster, it has lost its impact. And I think that is an exceptional difference between us and the Cleveland along the street. But that's just an opinion. George?
Yeah,
You and I will talk to that.
Yeah, and I think Detroit is unique as well because of what Maine said, and that is what we've been able to do in the past is respond inventively and creatively to the new opportunities / challenges. I fear that what we have become in the 20th century hamstrings our ability to do that in the future. What we became in the 20th century, as I see it, is essentially an oligopoly-dominated economic base that had to generate dialectically its own counterweight, which is huge unionization. And what have we learned from this almost a century-long battle between union and labor? Well, the oligopolies have learned that the more activities that they could internalize and implement themselves, the better off they will be because they have more control over that. Union workers, I think, learned the lessons that you succeed by collective bargaining, not by entrepreneurship. You succeed by seniority, not education. You succeed by industrial conflict. All right, now how do those mindsets position us for the future? Well, the statistics are pretty grim. The educational levels of not just the city of Detroit public school graduates, but generic people in southeast Michigan are pathetically low by 21st century standards. Entrepreneurial activity by all sorts of measures, incredibly low in this region. Venture capital, incredibly low in this region. I fear that we aren't going to have the prospects for the same creative entrepreneurial responses to the current / future challenges like we have had in the past because of the momentum of the legacies of the city we've become in the 20th century.
Panel wish to comment?
Well, the exception would be, and talk to Steve Tabak of Global Detroit, is the immigrant community. Those statistics don't, I agree they hold up region-wide.
And how pro-immigrant is this community?
Oh, hugely, right.
Go kids.
I want to, there's so many things that are said I want to respond to, but Louise, did you want to jump in on something? I didn't want to.
Well, that was one of my dissertation was how do cities, muster revitalization? So Pittsburgh said we're gonna drop our history, we're gonna go to the future. And Cleveland said, well, we have assets. Why should we give up manufacturing? It would always be a piece of what we do. And you have to do both. And Detroit will move forward with the kinds of assets we have. Michael Schwartz said a long time ago, and Markson said a long time ago that there's sticky places because they have particular kinds of assets. And with whatever the new postmodern supply chain is going to look like, with the internet, you really do need to think of those concentrated assets. I think that's really the crucial thing, and every city's going to have to do that. So our past will be part of our future. It's just going to be reconfigured. And so that great video, that presentation that you did, Susan, really does allow us to think about, we could position ourselves, and obviously the corporations are thinking about that. We can't do without oligopoly. Somebody's got to have money to venture capital in the first place. Where's that money going to come from? Right now there's a big battle between the oligopolies. Ford can move forward because they can go to the electric car, but on the other hand, the entire state and the entire country is still pulling us back to oil and natural gas. And of course, why is Pittsburgh coming back? Fracking! So, it's not all the medical inventiveness, it's, people from Texas moving to Youngstown and moving to Pittsburgh because they need oil engineers and natural gas engineers. That's why, ironic.
Can I say a quick word?
Can we gather everything in here from fracking to... of course we can.
This is just a very quick response. You just gave me this idea because it's close to this, close to that. I wonder, because when you said about the video, could we be a transformation. There's never been like a pre-school, it's always been like post-modern, pre-amazingness, you know? Because that'll pull us forward instead of like yanking, anyway, it's just a little word.
Well, that's very interesting, because I think there's a problem with language, that our
Yes.
experience is way before, is way ahead of our language. So we're having even trouble with the names of new areas, you know, like photography and electronic arts. When we name new genres, new genres are already 2 decades old, it sounds retro. So we're having problems across the board with languaging. And so then also with the problem with the, how do we invite, where we have a mayor talking about, you know, cutting back on the bus system in crisis, how do we engage our political leaders? And why isn't someone from the city here, you know, to listen to this brainstorming, and how they can apply that to our city in an immediate way? And how can we stop the deadlock of our own larger legislative system that's so invested in oil and so invested in not serving us. So, and also, as much as I love Conyers and Levin, they're like really old guys. Okay, so we need young people in our government and in our civic government. We need young people. We need young, new, energetic leaders willing to go into new areas that they don't know where they're going. Right?
Well said. Well said. I am conscious of the clock. I'd like to make sure that everybody in the audience has had a chance to speak and comment about what has been, I think, a very interesting day. And thank you, Walter, for putting this together. So the ball is in your court again, folks.
Well, I just want to, not to change the topic completely, but I like when he talked about the vicious circle of frustration in Detroit, about you get frustrated by your situation, and then the way that you approach it is irrational, and it ends up frustrating you even more. So I just want to know if there's a way, because I agree, and I think one thing that Detroit has that keeps people poor or keeps the poverty line still there is hopelessness. Once you reach a certain level of poverty, you become hopeless that you can't progress anymore. And I don't think there's any way of progression without optimism. Well, that's just my personal belief. Without optimism, like people don't assume certain programs will work. They already, before the programs even start, they already gave up on it. So I don't know if and I don't think they take the mental aspect of this situation seriously yet, because there's physical programs of how to try to fix it, but you still have that mental hopelessness that's still there. So I just want to know if there's like a way to approach that, to at least, because I think, if you feel good, you work harder and all of this. So I just want to know if there's a way to approach the mental aspect of the situation.
That's a great last question to challenge our 5 panelists with to end our session today. Who wants to have a go at that? It's a very interesting question. It really is.
I agree with you that hope is an important psychological resource that people crave, and that they behave very differently with it than without it. And I think it's fundamental. And I think, unfortunately, that a declining system like Detroit, systematically, in a variety of forms of people's experience, snuffs out hope. It dashes it after a while. And I'm concerned about how those systems can be transformed so that we don't plunge so many people into this pit of hopelessness, and that conversely we can give people more hope that there is a future for them. I don't pretend that I have easy answers for that, other than I think that's an important dimension of how we should think about planning and policy making that hasn't been given enough attention in the past, just like you suggested.
I just want to say, you should give to the younger scholars, because I think older scholars are just so sick at heart, because we all started with optimism too. I mean, I grew up in the 60s, I watched social movements, I believe in community organizing, and we still have oligopolies sitting on top of us, and we can't move forward. I just get so frustrated that I think somebody who doesn't know all that history, an anti-history perspective just for a minute, if you don't know all that history, then you have the courage to go forward. So anybody who's new, who's not so jaded.
And that's why I reached out to these 3 younger women who do represent the potential of bringing scholarship together around these common themes. So it is appropriate that they get the last word if they want.
Well, I think we all know the famous quote, those who do not remember history are condemned to repeat it. So I think that there is a place for understanding our history and being able to take that and synthesize it into the strategies and the decision-making processes that we engage in. But I think we have to be careful that it doesn't overwhelm us as part of that process. And again, I suppose, in a sense, in a different part of my career, so there is that optimism. But even just with my students, I'm just truly overwhelmed. We did a survey in class the other day. This is a planning majors course, and we were talking about brain drain, this phenomenon of losing really great minds, folks that are recent college graduates and are taking their education and moving elsewhere. They're going to Chicago, they're going to Atlanta, they're going to Phoenix, they're going to other areas, and so we're losing talent, we're losing intellect and talent, and how do we stem that? And so we did this exercise. Well, how many of you plan on staying here in Michigan when you graduate? I was actually overwhelmed that 9 out of 10 said they wanted to stay. And we ended up having this really great discussion about, the vacant land that is now a former Tiger Stadium, and different things that we can do with that, and how we create between these empty spaces, even between our major centers like New Center and Midtown and Downtown. How do we begin to really connect these areas? What do we populate these areas with? And there was just overall this general sense of hopefulness. So I think, and I can't remember, I think it was Laura that suggested, or maybe Constance, I'm sorry. But that suggested that yes, it's important to put place in history in its proper context. I think it would be unwise not to consider that. But when we look forward, we really need to really open it up and have policies or incentives in place to want to make these young people stay here in Michigan, to provide some kind of, whether it's a program or incentive, to keep them here, because I think so many of them do truly care, and if they could find a place where they could make a difference, they would be more likely to stay. And so I think it's critical we retain.
Constance, Lara?
Yes.
Final point.
Okay. So as a way of both answering your question and then maybe tying together this discussion of the Detroit School and this very interesting question about do we really need one? And oh, by the way, has anybody done the Detroit drinking game? May mentioned the word resilience, which means she's going to have to take a shot at the reception. Anytime anyone calls Detroiters resilient, it's just, anyway. So we're going to get to
Resilient?
That. Yeah, you get to drink too. But quickly. So I take your concern very seriously, and I think it's very important. I don't want you to think that I'm sort of naively optimistic, and I thank Robin for calling me on. I live in Detroit, and so I see this kind of helplessness that you're describing. I believe the Detroit School exists. I think it is a study of South and Central American cities. These cities have the same kind of disparity that we experience, but they have huge informal settlements. And now, I think the study of informality and the favelas that exist in these cities, I think would be hugely important to look at for Detroit. I'm not advocating.
I just taught that this
Did
last
you really?
week. Janice Perlman.
We must be talking to our students about these things. Now, I'm not, and I visited limited amounts of them, and I'm not saying that these are the ideal places, but they are a higher quality of life than exists even in some of our neighborhoods in this city. So I think a very important model, perhaps for U of M, to take a look at. But in response to that, I agree with what everybody said about we're hindered by the patriarchy. We've been failed by it, right? The corporate patriarchy, the public sector, the institutional sector. but we still somehow cannot free ourselves of it. So what I say to you as a young Detroiter, and all young Detroiters, is, get out there, be informal, experiment.
Good. Last word.
I would agree with that. I would just leave, I think reading history, and I think we all, have to be critical readers of history, and so that can be discouraging, which is discouraging in a different way than living next to an abandoned house, right? It's a different kind of hopelessness. But just this, I've been doing a little bit of surveying with involving students in the Morningside neighborhood of Detroit, which is, has some new building, but also a lot of abandonment. And I was just reading this week student reflection papers. And at our school we have students from all over the metropolitan region, including the city. And so some of them, it's a big deal for them to be going door to door in Detroit. And I just love reading these reflection essays because they are so positive, and it's not that people don't recognize the challenges, it's that they feel connected because they talk with people in the neighborhood and they see, they can relate to them. And so I feel a lot of hope in that if we can, as institutions, create those kinds of opportunities that the people don't have to be different than who they are. They need contacts, they need opportunities, access, and that's very positive.
So I do get the last word. In 1972, there was a journal in the city that I come from who said that my town, the city of Glasgow, would be the first city of industrial waste, the waste that you throw away. It would be finished, gone, dead. 10 years later, in fact 12 years later, the city, the populace of the city decided that they weren't going to look back. They'd looked back for 300 years, it was time to look forward. Lots of problems. Unemployment higher than it is here in Detroit. Vacant housing higher than in many of the communities that we have here. And a dependent population that very few people here would even understand. George does. Today, it's ranked 10th on the Condé Nast places for people to visit. And it's largely due to one thing. I think the people of the city of Glasgow decided that they had to make the place relevant. It had to be a place that people wanted to be in and wanted to visit and wanted to be part of their life. My concern is, and an optimism as well, that there's a lot of people here in the region don't see Detroit as relevant to their life. It's sort of irrelevant to their life. If we can make the downtown, this area, parts of the city relevant, then I think Detroit itself has a hopeful future. Thank you for the question. It was really good. Thank you for staying at 6 o'clock. Thank you.
I want to thank this panel, this wonderful panel that Robin put together, and I want to thank Robin Martin, the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, for collaborating with the Humanities Center in sponsoring this conference. And I wish to invite you all to a